The Doom of Valyria was the most catastrophic event in the history of the Game of Thrones universe, an apocalyptic disaster that wiped out the world's most advanced civilization in a single day. But what if it never happened? What if the Dragonlords of Valyria continued their reign of fire and blood? The world of House of the Dragon wouldn't just be different, it would be unrecognizable. Today, I'm breaking down the most mind-blowing consequences of a world where Valyria never fell. And trust me, when you learn about consequence number 5, you'll realize why George R.R. Martin had to destroy Valyria for his story to even exist. Before we dive into this alternate history, we need to understand what Valyria actually was. It wasn't just another kingdom or empire, it was the most advanced, powerful civilization the world had ever seen. For nearly 5,000 years, the Valyrian freehold dominated Essos with dragons, blood magic, and technology so advanced it bordered on science fiction. The Doom, which occurred about 100 years before Aegon's conquest, was a cataclysmic series of volcanic eruptions that destroyed the Valyrian peninsula in a single day. Almost every Dragonlord family was wiped out instantly, with only House Targaryen surviving because they had relocated to Dragonstone 12 years earlier. This disaster fundamentally reshaped the world's power structure. Without it, everything we see in House of the Dragon, from the Targaryen conquest to the Dance of the Dragons, would never have happened. The ripple effects would be enormous, changing not just political boundaries but the very nature of society, technology, and magic in this world. I've analyzed Fire and Blood, the world of Ice and Fire, and all available lore to identify the 8 most significant ways the world would be different if Valyria had never fallen. So let's explore this fascinating alternate history where dragons never stopped ruling the skies. No Targaryen conquest. Westeros remains divided. The most obvious consequence of Valyria's survival would be that Aegon's conquest never happens. The Targaryens were a relatively minor Dragonlord family who only became world-changing figures because they were the sole survivors of the Doom. If Valyria had continued, the Targaryens would have remained what they were, just one family among 40 Dragonlord houses with no particular claim to greatness. Without the Targaryen conquest, Westeros would have remained divided into 7 independent kingdoms, each with their own distinct culture and ruling dynasty. The Starks would still rule the north, the Lannisters the Westerlands, the Gardeners not the Tyrells the Reach, the Durandons not the Baratheons the Stormlands, the Arryns the Vale, the Hoars not the Tullys the Riverlands, and the Martells Dorne. These kingdoms had existed independently for thousands of years before Aegon, fighting each other in endless border disputes and temporary alliances. Without the unifying force of the Iron Throne, this pattern would have continued indefinitely. What makes this particularly interesting is that Westeros might actually have been better off this way. The centralized power of the Iron Throne created a system where continent-wide civil wars became possible, like the Dance of the Dragons or the War of the Five Kings. With separate kingdoms, conflicts would have remained more localized and potentially less devastating. However, a divided Westeros would have been far more vulnerable to external threats, particularly from Valyria itself. Which brings us to our next consequence. Valyrian invasion of Westeros, dragons conquer the continent. Anyway, if Valyria had survived, Westeros would not have remained independent for long. The Valyrian freehold was an expansionist empire that had already conquered most of western Essos. The only reason they never expanded into Westeros was that they fell before they got around to it. The Valyrians had already established colonies and outposts along the eastern coast of Westeros. Dragonstone was a Valyrian trading post before it became the Targaryen stronghold. The city of Driftmark, seat of House Velaryon, was another Valyrian settlement. These were the advance bases for what would have eventually become a full-scale invasion. With hundreds of dragons at their disposal, not just the 3 Aegon had, the Valyrians would have conquered Westeros far more thoroughly than the Targaryens ever did. The 7 kingdoms, even united, would have had no defense against an armada of dragons. We saw what 3 dragons could do under Aegon, imagine 50 or 100. This conquest would have been fundamentally different from Aegon's. The Targaryens adopted Westerosi customs, converted to the faith of the 7, and essentially became Westerosi rulers who happened to have dragons. A Valyrian conquest would have meant the imposition of Valyrian culture, religion, and social systems, including their practice of slavery, which was banned in Westeros. The brutal truth is that Westeros under Valyrian rule would have become just another collection of colonies, like the free cities of Essos. The great houses would have been subjugated or eliminated, their castles melted by dragonfire, their lands redistributed to Valyrian nobles. The entire cultural and political landscape we see in House of the Dragon would never have existed. Slavery in Westeros, the dark foundation of Valyrian power. One of the most disturbing consequences of Valyrian survival would be the introduction of industrial-scale slavery to Westeros. Slavery was the foundation of Valyrian society. Their entire economy and way of life depended on the labor of millions of slaves. The Valyrians didn't just keep household servants, they operated massive slave mines beneath the 14 Flames, their chain of volcanoes. Tens of thousands of slaves would be worked to death in these mines each year, extracting gold, silver, and the mysterious substances that fueled Valyrian magic. If Valyria had conquered Westeros, they would have implemented this same system there. The mines of the Westerlands, currently operated by paid if exploited workers under House Lannister, would have been converted to slave operations. The agricultural regions like the Reach would have seen their small folk enslaved to work the fields for Valyrian masters. This would have represented a fundamental shift in Westerosi society. While the small folk in Westeros are hardly free in the modern sense, they do have certain rights and protections under both law and custom. They cannot be bought and sold, they can own property, and they can even rise in station through exceptional service or marriage. All of this would have been stripped away under Valyrian rule. The most controversial aspect of this is that Valyrian slavery might have actually been more efficient in purely economic terms. The massive infrastructure projects we see in Essos, the Valyrian roads of fused stone, the massive cities, the elaborate canal systems, were all built with slave labor on a scale that free Westeros could never match. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between technological advancement and human exploitation. Valyria's wonders were built on the broken backs of millions of slaves. Would Westeros have become more advanced under Valyrian rule but at the cost of its soul? No decline of magic, a world still full of wonders. One of the most significant themes in both House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones is the decline of magic. Dragons had died out by the time of Game of Thrones, only to be reborn with Daenerys. The children of the forest are believed extinct. Wargs and green seers are incredibly rare. Magic in general is fading from the world. If Valyria had survived, none of this would be true. Magic would still be a powerful, everyday force in the world, centered on but not limited to Valyria itself. Dragons would never have declined in numbers or size. Instead of the handful of dragons we see in House of the Dragon, there would be hundreds, perhaps thousands. The Valyrians had mastered dragon breeding, producing new varieties and maintaining their health and size across generations. The systematic study of magic would have continued in Valyrian academies and institutions. Instead of the Citadel's skeptical, science-focused approach to knowledge, magical research would be at the forefront of intellectual endeavor. Techniques for fire magic, blood magic, prophetic visions, and other supernatural arts would be refined and expanded. This would have profound implications for the White Walkers and the threat from the north. In the current timeline, the return of the White Walkers coincides with a world where magic has faded and few remember how to fight them. In a world where Valyria never fell, the response would be very different. Dragons, Valyrian Steel, and magical knowledge would provide powerful weapons against the undead threat. The most disturbing aspect of this is that the Valyrians might have been aware of the White Walker threat all along. There are hints in the lore that Daenerys Targaryen's prophetic dream that led them to leave Valyria wasn't just about the Doom, but about a greater threat to come. If Valyria had survived, they might have been preparing for the Long Night for centuries, accumulating magical knowledge specifically to combat the White Walkers. This raises a provocative question. Was the decline of magic after the Doom actually part of what made the world vulnerable to the White Walkers' return? Did the loss of Valyrian knowledge create the conditions for the existential threat we see in Game of Thrones? No rise of the faith, religion transformed. In the world of House of the Dragon, the dominant religion in Westeros is the Faith of the Seven, brought by the Andals thousands of years ago. The faith has enormous influence over politics, culture, and daily life throughout most of the Seven Kingdoms. If Valyria had survived and conquered Westeros, this religious landscape would be completely transformed. The Valyrians had their own gods, a pantheon that included Balerion, Vhagar, and Merryxes, who later gave their names to Targaryen dragons. They were generally tolerant of other religions, not out of benevolence but out of indifference. They allowed conquered peoples to worship as they pleased, as long as they paid their taxes and provided slaves. Under Valyrian rule, the Faith of the Seven would have been reduced to a local cult, one of many religions tolerated but not particularly respected by the ruling class. The High Septon would have no political power, and the Great Septits would never have been built. More significantly, the Valyrians might have actively promoted their own religious practices among the elite of conquered territories. We know they practice blood magic and fire magic, often involving human sacrifice. These rituals might have become part of the expected duties of Westerosi nobles under Valyrian rule, forcing them to participate in practices their ancestors would have considered abominable. The most controversial aspect of this religious transformation is that it might have actually reduced religious conflict in Westeros. The faith militant uprising that caused so much bloodshed during the early Targaryen dynasty would never have happened under Valyrian rule. The Valyrians would have crushed any such resistance with overwhelming force, as they did with rebellions in their other territories. This creates an uncomfortable truth. Religious tolerance in the Valyrian system came not from respect for diversity, but from a combination of indifference and overwhelming power that made resistance futile. Peace through tyranny rather than peace through understanding. Genetic manipulation. The dark science of Valyria. One of the most disturbing aspects of Valyrian civilization that's only hinted at in the source material is their apparent experimentation with genetics and blood magic. There are suggestions that the Valyrians weren't content with just taming dragons, they wanted to reshape life itself according to their desires. The evidence for this is scattered throughout the lore. The manticores, basilisks, and other unnatural creatures mentioned in the books are said to be the result of Valyrian experiments. The Sphinx's creatures with human faces but the bodies of various animals might not have been merely statues, but actual living beings created through blood magic. If Valyria had survived, these experiments would have continued and expanded. With Westeros under their control, they would have had new populations to experiment on and new environments to adapt their creations to. This might have extended to human modification as well. The Targaryens' distinctive Valyrian features, silver gold hair and purple eyes, might be the result of deliberate genetic manipulation rather than just selective breeding. There are hints that the Valyrians were trying to create the perfect dragon rider bloodline, using blood magic to enhance certain traits. In a world where Valyria never fell, these experiments might have produced humanoid subspecies designed for specific purposes. Warriors with enhanced strength, miners who could withstand extreme heat, even human-dragon hybrids. The ethical implications are horrifying, but entirely consistent with what we know of Valyrian attitudes toward those they considered inferior. The most controversial aspect of this is that some of these genetic modifications might have been beneficial in certain ways. The Targaryens' resistance to fire and disease, for instance, could be seen as positive traits. In a world facing threats like the White Walkers, having warriors specifically engineered to fight them might save countless lives. This creates a moral dilemma. Would the benefits of such advanced biological knowledge outweigh the ethical horror of how it was developed? It's a question without easy answers, but one that would be central to a world where Valyria never fell. No House of the Dragon. A different kind of civil war. The final and perhaps most meta consequence of Valyria's survival is that the entire story of House of the Dragon would never have happened. The Dance of the Dragons, the Targaryen civil war that forms the central conflict of the show, was only possible because the Targaryens were the sole surviving Dragonlord family. In a world where Valyria never fell, the Targaryens would remain a minor Dragonlord house among many. They would never rule Westeros, never sit on the Iron Throne, and never have the opportunity to fight among themselves for succession. However, this doesn't mean there wouldn't be civil wars involving dragons. The history of Valyria before the Doom includes numerous conflicts between Dragonlord families, often fought with multiple dragons on each side. These dragon wars were far more devastating than anything seen in House of the Dragon, with dozens of dragons involved rather than just a handful. If Valyria had survived, these conflicts would have continued and occasionally spilled over into their conquered territories, including Westeros. Imagine the Field of Fire from Aegon's conquest, but with 20 dragons on each side rather than 3 against none. Entire regions could be reduced to ash in the crossfire of Dragonlord politics. The most disturbing aspect of this is that Westerosi lives would be treated as completely expendable in these conflicts. At least in the Dance of the Dragons, both the Blacks and the Greens were fighting over Westeros itself, giving them some stake in not completely destroying it. Valyrian Dragonlords fighting each other would have no such restraint. Westerosi cities, castles, and populations would be acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of power. This creates a provocative thought. As terrible as the Dance of the Dragons was, it might actually represent a more humane form of dragon warfare than what would have occurred under continued Valyrian rule. The Targaryens, for all their flaws, had become Westerosi enough to care about the realm they were fighting over. True Valyrians would have no such attachment. If Valyria had never fallen, the world of House of the Dragon would be unrecognizable. Westeros would be just another Valyrian colony, its ancient houses subjugated or destroyed, its people enslaved, its landscape transformed by Valyrian architecture and magic. Dragons would fill the skies, magical knowledge would continue to advance, and the technological level of society would be far higher, but at a terrible cost in human freedom and dignity. This alternate history reveals something profound about George R.R. Martin's world building. The Doom of Valyria wasn't just a random catastrophe, it was a necessary reset that allowed for the more balanced, human-scale conflicts we see in House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones. Without the Doom, the world would be dominated by a single overwhelming power, making the complex political struggles that define these stories impossible. It also highlights the central tension in how Martin portrays magic and technology in his world. The Valyrians represent the pinnacle of magical achievement, but also the pinnacle of human cruelty and exploitation. Their fall allowed for a world with less magic, but more humanity. A world where individual choices matter more than the overwhelming force of dragons and spells. As we continue watching House of the Dragon, it's worth remembering that the Targaryen dynasty, for all its fire and blood, represents only a pale shadow of Valyria's power. The conflicts we see, even the devastating Dance of the Dragons, are taking place in a world already diminished from its height, a world where magic is fading and dragons are becoming rarer. Perhaps that's for the best. A world where Valyria never fell would be more magical, more advanced, and more wondrous, but also far more terrible for the majority of people living in it. If you enjoyed this exploration of what might have been if Valyria had survived, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which aspect of this alternate history you find most fascinating or disturbing. This is Explainified, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching this deep dive into the alternate history of a world where Valyria never fell. If you want to learn more about the actual history of Valyria and the Doom, check out my video on the Valyrian Empire Explained, which I'll link right here. And don't forget to subscribe for more House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones explained videos coming every week. This is Explainified, and I'll see you in the next one.